Okay, so he asked me about my career in mathematics and how that transitioned into making some money, making a lot of money. Well, I was a mathematician. I wrote a pretty good thesis. My thesis advisor said that's too tough a problem, don't do it. That only made me want to do it, and I did. And it came out quite nice. It was printed in the annals. And from there, I went to MIT to be a Moore instructor. But at the time, I had done something else. I had made a small investment with my Colombian friends. I had some friends in Colombia. And I urged them to get together and make a business, which they did. And I had 10% of it that I had borrowed from my family and my father. So after a year at MIT as an instructor, I was an assistant professor at Harvard for a couple of years, but I wasn't making very much money, and I owed this money. So there's a place in Princeton called the Institute for Defense Analyses, which is a highly classified government operation designed to crack Russian codes, if you could. And they hired mathematicians, and they paid very well, and they hired me, and I liked the work, and I liked the work. At one point, near the end of my stay there, I solved an outstanding problem in that curious field, for which a special purpose computer was built in the National Security Agency. And as far as I know, that computer is still running to implement my little algorithm. From there, I left there, and but while I was there, I worked on something called minimal varieties. Minimal varieties are manifolds inside other manifolds whose with boundary, and the boundary, spanning the boundary is a surface or a higher dimensional surface, and it's minimal with respect to anything else that spans that boundary. So, for example, if you take a wire frame, dip it in soap bubbles, pull it out, you'll get this beautiful film that's attached to that boundary, and that film has less area than any other thing that would span that boundary. So that's called a minimal surface. Jesse Douglas won the first Fields Medal, I think in 2005, by showing that, yes, you could always do this with any frame, and it would always be a smooth surface. And it was called the plateau problem, after a guy named Plateau, actually, as it wasn't. So that got me interested in that field in higher dimensions. And so while I was at the Institute for Advanced Study, I worked very hard on that area, showed that up through dimension 7, you could always, ambient dimension 7, you could always have, if you had a boundary of dimension 5, you could always fill it in with a minimal variety of dimension 6. So that was nice. But the proof didn't work one dimension up. It just didn't work. And And I found what I thought was a counterexample. It was the three-sphere crossed itself in 8-dimensional space. So that made a 6-dimensional boundary in 8-dimensional space. And then I just connected it to the origin. So it was like a cone, and showed that that cone was minimal. It wasn't smooth at all. It had this point, which the lower dimensional ones didn't. And so I put up that as a counterexample, but I couldn't prove it was. But a few years later, a guy named Bombieri, three Italians showed that it was actually a counterexample. So that was a very good piece of work. I was very pleased by it. But I left the Institute and went to Stoney Brook at 30 years old to head their math department. And it was not a strong department, Stoney Brook, but the physics department was terrific. And while I was there, I was hiring a lot of people. We had a lot of money and to build up the department. But I also got interested in another aspect of mathematics, and I won't go into the details, but I came up with quite a beautiful construction on a closed three-dimensional Riemannian manifold. A closed manifold, Riemannian means it has a metric, and I came up with some invariant of that. It was actually a conformal invariant. And it had various properties. I was very pleased with it. I showed it to Chern. How many of you in the audience have heard of Chern? Okay, that's a reasonable number. He was the great man in differential geometry, and he was a friend of mine, and I showed him this work. And he said, "Oh, you did it in 3 dimensions, but it should be doable in all dimensions." Oh, okay. I was dubious, but we worked together, and it did. So we published the paper, and about 5 years later, I think it was Witten in Princeton, he was a physicist, started using that math. And then other physicists use that math. And it just shows you don't know, you do a piece of work and you don't really know where it's going to end up, what it's going to lead to. Because all kinds of physicists in every area almost seem to use what's called Chern-Simons to do their physics. So every day, on average, 4 papers are published in the physics archives. 4 papers are published on average talking about Chern-Simons. So I was, I've been dumbfounded at that outcome, but there it was. So that was the math part. Now you wanted to know the money part.
Yes, please.
Well, the money part. Well, as I said, I had invested with my Colombian friends. The business got sold, and I had a fair amount of money. And this was while I was still at Stoney Brook. And so it seemed interesting to invest that money, actually to trade it. And so I traded currencies, foreign currencies, with this little bit of money I had, and I did pretty well. And at a certain point, I decided to leave academia. I hired a few people to get into the investment activity with me. We were trading commodities of all sorts, and well, the firm grew and grew and grew and grew until we had about 300 people working for us. This fund has been the most successful hedge fund ever in terms of its returns, annual returns. And I ran that company, that fund, until about 10 years ago when I stepped down to go into my third career, which was, we had a foundation that Marilyn had started, and Marilyn, my wife, we had started a foundation. It was focusing on science, and I joined up with the foundation and spent my time there, and I have done so for the last 10 years. So that's, oh, yeah, the money story.